When the last giant in the Bible fell, he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. No name, no kingdom. The last of a bloodline over 1,000 years old. Most people have heard of the Nephilim, but the Bible does not name one race of giants. It names 5, each with a different Hebrew name, a different territory, and a different fate. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. God sent a flood to destroy all flesh. 8 people survived. The giants should have been finished. But centuries later, when Israel reached Canaan, 5 races of giants were already there, fortified, armed, waiting. The Bible never fully explains how. In this video, we are going to trace each of the 5 giant bloodlines, who they were, what their Hebrew names reveal about them, where they ruled, and how each one was destroyed. From the Watchers on Mount Hermon to the last unnamed giant dying in the dust of Gath. Subscribe to Bible Origins. This is the story they did not tell you. Number 1. The Nephilim. The word first appears in Genesis chapter 6, and its meaning has been debated for 3,000 years. When men began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Hebrew word is Nephilim, from the root naphal, meaning to fall. The fallen ones. When the Greek translators of the Septuagint encountered this word, they chose the Greek gigantes, the same word used for the Titans who waged war against the gods of Olympus. The Nephilim were not simply tall. They were a theological category of corruption, the offspring of a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. The Book of Enoch, composed during the Second Temple period, expands the account. 200 angelic beings known as the Watchers descended upon Mount Hermon, the towering snow-capped peak at the northern boundary of Canaan, swore a mutual oath, and took human wives. The location was not random. Mount Hermon sits at the northern edge of the Bashan Plateau, the exact territory that would later be ruled by King Og, the last of the Rephaim. In Canaanite and Ugaritic texts, Bashan was associated with the netherworld and gateways to the realm of the dead. The Watchers descended on the mountain the ancient world already associated with the gateway between heaven and the abyss. Their offspring were beings of monstrous size who consumed the produce of the earth, then turned on humanity itself, devouring men, drinking blood, and filling the earth with violence. God decreed their destruction through the flood. Remarkably, fragments of a text called the Book of Giants were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, ancient Aramaic manuscripts that tell the story from the giants' perspective. In these fragments, the giants dream of their own coming destruction, a garden uprooted, a tablet submerged in water, an entire world washed clean. They send messengers to Enoch to interpret the visions. The answer comes back. You are doomed. It is one of the only ancient texts in which the giants are not simply monsters. They are conscious beings watching their own extinction approach. The flood was supposed to end them. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 describe the total destruction of all flesh on the earth. Noah and his family, 8 souls, were the only survivors. And yet, if the flood destroyed all flesh, how did giants appear in Canaan centuries later? When the 12 spies entered the Promised Land in the Book of Numbers, they reported seeing the descendants of Anak, and they used the word Nephilim. The giants were back. 3 theories have dominated this debate for thousands of years. The first is a second incursion. Fallen angels repeated the transgression after the flood, producing new giant offspring in Canaan. The second is genetic survival. The bloodline passed through one of the wives aboard the ark. Genesis records that Noah was blameless in his generations, but says nothing about his sons' wives. If the giant bloodline passed through one of them, possibly the wife of Ham, it would explain why the post-flood giant clans appear exclusively in territories associated with Ham's descendants and the cursed line of Canaan. The third is rhetorical fear. The terrified spies in Numbers 13 use the word Nephilim as hyperbole, invoking the bogeyman of ancient memory to discourage Israel from entering the land. The text does not resolve the mystery. What it does resolve is the result. Regardless of how they returned, the situation waiting for Israel in the land of Canaan was the same. When God told Abraham that his descendants would inherit this land, that land was not empty. It was occupied by giant clans that had been entrenching themselves for centuries, fortifying cities, breeding warriors, and building a civilization so physically intimidating that the most faithful generation in Israel's history would one day see them and break. The Promised Land was not a gift sitting on a shelf waiting to be collected. It was a fortress held by 5 races of giants, and God was sending his people straight into it. The most powerful of those races controlled the volcanic highlands north of the Jordan. Number 2. The Rephaim. The first giant clan appears in Genesis chapter 14. Their name, depending on who translates it, means either the healers or the terrible ones. The Hebrew root Rapha carries both meanings, a duality that only makes sense in light of the Canaanite texts discovered at Ugarit in modern Syria. Tablets from the 13th century before Christ describe beings called the Rephaim, deified warrior kings who descended into the underworld and became shades, spectral rulers of the realm of the dead. One tablet describes a figure named Rapu who rules in Ashtaroth and Edrei, the exact 2 cities the Bible assigns to King Og in Joshua 12. Same word, same cities, 2 independent ancient sources. The Bible uses the word Rephaim in the same dual sense. In the historical books, the Rephaim are the living giant clans who occupied the land. In the poetic and prophetic books, Proverbs, Isaiah, the Psalms, the Rephaim are the shades of the dead dwelling in Sheol, giants in life, ghosts in death. The name carried terror in both directions. Their territory was vast. The Rephaim controlled the volcanic plateau of Bashan, the modern Golan Heights, a landscape of black basalt fields and ancient oak forests high above the Jordan Rift Valley. Their holdings stretched across Ammon, Moab, and as far south as the Valley of Rephaim beside Jerusalem itself. The plateau is dotted with thousands of massive stone dolmens, megalithic tombs built from basalt boulders so heavy that modern engineers cannot explain how they were moved. They were not a scattered tribe. They were an entrenched military civilization. The earliest military engagement against the Rephaim appears in Genesis 14. Chedorlaomer and his eastern coalition struck the Rephaim, the Zuzim, and the Amim on their own territory. But the giants survived. They always survived, until God decided otherwise. The last and greatest of the Rephaim kings was Og, king of Bashan. Deuteronomy chapter 3 verse 11 preserves his epitaph, "Only Og king of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, 13.5 feet long, 6 feet wide." The Hebrew word translated as iron, barzel, describes a dark, heavy metal. The Bashan region is composed of black volcanic basalt, an iron-rich stone so dense that ancient craftsmen treated it with reverence. Many scholars now believe Og's iron bed was not a sleeping frame at all. It was a massive basalt sarcophagus, a coffin the size of a modern vehicle, kept on display in the Ammonite capital of Rabbah as a trophy of the giant king who ruled 60 fortified cities. And then, Moses arrived. Consider what Moses was facing. Og was not merely another Canaanite king. He was the last living representative of an entire race. Deuteronomy says it plainly. Only Og was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. The bloodline that had terrorized the ancient world was down to one throne, one army, one king, and that king marched every soldier he had out of his basalt fortress to meet Israel in the open field. If Og won, the Rephaim would survive. If Moses won, the most ancient giant dynasty on earth would be erased from history. Numbers chapter 21, verses 33 through 35 record the confrontation. God spoke directly to Moses before the battle. "Do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands, with his whole army and his land." 6 words, "Do not be afraid of him," spoken by God himself. And with those words, the outcome was decided before the first sword was drawn. Israel struck down Og, his sons, and his entire army. They conquered all 60 of his fortified cities. Not a single survivor remained. The giant king who had ruled from a basalt throne on the heights of Bashan fell on the eastern bank of the Jordan, and Israel had not yet set foot in the promised land. The Rephaim were the most famous, but they were not the only giants east of the Jordan. 2 other races held the lands of Moab and Ammon, and the Bible gives them names that tell you everything you need to know. Number 3, the Emim. Now step back and look at the map. Because what Moses reveals in Deuteronomy chapter 2 is not a footnote about 2 minor tribes. It is a strategic revelation that changes everything. Before Israel arrived, the land surrounding the Jordan was not held by one race of giants. It was held by several, and God had already been clearing them out, one by one, using nations that were not even his covenant people. East of the Dead Sea, in the territory that would become Moab, a giant race called the Emim held the land. The word in Hebrew is emim, frightful ones, terrors. Moses describes them. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim, tall as the Anakim, counted as Rephaim, and God destroyed them, not with Israel, not with Moses, not with any prophet. He used the Moabites, the descendants of Lot, a man who fled Sodom with nothing but the clothes on his back, a race of giants named the Terrors, wiped out by the children of a refugee. North of the Emim, another giant clan held the territory of Ammon. The Bible calls them the Zamzummim. In Genesis chapter 14, they are called the Zuzim. The name Zamzummim is almost certainly onomatopoeic, a mocking imitation of their strange, incomprehensible speech. The murmurers, the buzzers. A Hebrew audience hearing the name would have understood immediately. These were giants whose language sounded alien, inhuman, unsettling. Deuteronomy records their fate with blunt finality. The Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place. God used the Ammonites, also descendants of Lot, to wipe out the Zamzummim. No Israelite lifted a sword. No prophet issued a command. God simply cleared the board. Now consider what Moses was doing with this information. He was not delivering a history lesson. He was standing on the eastern bank of the Jordan, speaking to a nation about to invade a land still held by the Anakim. And his argument was devastating. The Emim are gone. God used Moab. The Zamzummim are gone. God used Ammon. The Rephaim are gone. You destroyed Og yourselves. 3 of the 5 giant races have already been eliminated. If God did all of that before you even crossed the river, what makes you think he cannot handle the Anakim? Moses was building a case, dismantling fear with evidence. The God who cleared the east side of the Jordan will clear the west side. Trust what you have already seen him do. The Emim and the Zamzummim are the forgotten giants of the Bible, but their erasure is the key that unlocks the entire story. Because by the time Israel stood on the banks of the Jordan, the map had already been redrawn. 3 giant races, gone. Only the Anakim remained, dug into the southern highlands of Canaan behind fortified walls. And it was the Anakim who broke Israel's nerve for 40 years. And the Zamzummim, number 4, the Anakim. The Hebrew word is Anak, neck, or long-necked. The Anakim descended from Anak, son of Arba, who founded Kiriath Arba, later renamed Hebron, one of the most important locations in the Old Testament. But before any of that, Hebron belonged to the giants. The Anakim were not unknown to the wider ancient world. Egyptian execration texts dating to the 19th century before Christ document a warrior group in Canaan called the Anak, the people of Anak. Centuries before Moses, ancient Egypt was already documenting the Anakim. In the second year after the Exodus, God commanded Moses to send 12 spies into Canaan to survey the land. They entered from the south, traveled through the Negev, and reached the valley of Eshcol, where they cut down a single cluster of grapes so enormous it required 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. The land was magnificent. The produce was staggering. But then they reached the hill country. Numbers chapter 13, verses 28 through 33 record what 10 of the 12 spies reported when they returned. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. They used the word Nephilim. Not tall men, not strong warriors. They invoked the name of the pre-flood terror to describe what they had seen. Whether this was accurate biology or terrified exaggeration, the effect was the same. The name shattered the courage of the entire nation. 2 of the 12 spies, Caleb and Joshua, saw the same giants, heard the same report, and reached the opposite conclusion. Caleb stood before the terrified assembly and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." The nation chose fear. Israel wept through the night. They accused Moses of leading them into the wilderness to die. They talked of stoning Moses and Aaron. They talked of choosing a new leader and marching back to Egypt, back to slavery, because slavery under Pharaoh felt safer than trusting God against the Anakim. God's response was immediate and devastating. Numbers chapter 14. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. Every man and woman over the age of 20, 600,000 fighting men and their families, was sentenced to wander in the desert for 40 years until the entire faithless generation had perished in the sand. Not because the Anakim were too strong, not because God's promise had failed, because Israel refused to believe the promise was real. The Anakim did not defeat Israel. Israel defeated itself. 45 years passed. Joshua chapter 14. The conquest of Canaan is winding down. Land is being distributed to the tribes. And an 85-year-old warrior walks up to Joshua and delivers the most emotionally devastating speech in the Old Testament. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions, but my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. And then the request. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there and their cities were large and fortified, but The Lord helping me, I will drive them out, just as he said." Consider the weight of that request. Caleb did not ask for farmland by the river. He did not ask for a quiet valley to retire in peace. He asked for Hebron, the exact fortress whose giants had terrified 10 spies and condemned a generation to die in the desert. He had spent 40 years burying men who should have been warriors but died as nomads because they feared that mountain. And at 85, when every other man his age was dead, Caleb asked for the one piece of land that symbolized everything Israel had lost to cowardice. "Give me this mountain." Joshua chapter 15 verses 13 through 14 record the result. Caleb drove out the 3 sons of Anak from Hebron, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. The 85-year-old warrior conquered the giants of Hebron personally. But Caleb could not clear the entire land alone. Joshua chapter 11 verses 21 through 22 records the wider campaign. Joshua went through the hill country and cut off the Anakim from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. He devoted them to destruction with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the people of Israel. And then the text delivers a single ominous footnote. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Joshua cleared the highlands, Caleb took Hebron, but 3 Philistine cities still harbored Anakim survivors. And from one of those cities, a champion emerged. Number 5, Goliath, Gaza, Gath, Ashdod. The Anakim survivors were absorbed into Philistine society. They married into Philistine families. They trained in Philistine armies, but they carried the bloodline of Anak. Generations passed. The period of the judges came and went. Samuel anointed Saul as king, and in the valley of Elah, the Philistine army assembled against Israel. Their champion stepped forward from the ranks. He was from Gath. His name was Goliath. And he was not simply a tall Philistine soldier. He was, almost certainly, a descendant of the Anakim refugees who had fled Joshua's conquest and found sanctuary in Philistine territory. David versus Goliath is not a standalone Sunday school lesson. It is the continuation of a war that began with Moses east of the Jordan and now reached the Philistine frontier where the last remnants of the giant bloodline had been hiding for generations. The height of Goliath has been debated for centuries. The Masoretic text records 6 cubits and a span, approximately 9 feet 9 inches. But the older Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript, the Septuagint, and Josephus all record 4 cubits and a span, approximately 6 feet 9 inches. Even at 6 feet 9, Goliath would have been terrifying. The average Israelite man stood approximately 5 foot 3. Goliath towered over every soldier by more than 1.5 feet, encased in a bronze scale coat weighing roughly 125 pounds, bronze greaves on his legs, a javelin across his back, and a spear with an iron point weighing 600 shekels. A shield-bearer walked ahead of him. He was not merely a large man, he was a walking fortress. For 40 days, the same number that defined Israel's punishment in the wilderness, Goliath taunted the armies of Israel. No soldier moved. The entire army of Saul was paralyzed with fear. It was Numbers 13 all over again. A giant stood in front of God's people, and God's people refused to fight. Then a shepherd boy arrived carrying bread and roasted grain for his brothers. David heard Goliath's challenge, and his first response was not fear, it was indignation. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David did not see a giant. He saw a man defying a God who had already defeated every giant race from Bashan to Hebron. David stood in the same tradition as Caleb, Joshua, and Moses, men who faced the giant bloodlines and refused to be afraid. Goliath came with armor, javelin, sword, and shield-bearer. David came with a sling and 5 smooth stones, and a declaration that echoes across 4,000 years. You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. 1 stone, 1 strike. The giant from Gath fell face first into the dirt. David ran forward, drew Goliath's own sword from its sheath, and cut off the giant's head. But the biblical record reveals something most readers never notice. Goliath was not the last giant. 4 more were waiting. 2 Samuel chapter 21 records their deaths with the precision of a military ledger. The first was Ishbi-Benob. He carried a massive new bronze spear and had one stated objective: kill King David. Years had passed since the Valley of Elah. David was no longer the young shepherd who ran toward Goliath. He was an aging king, and in this battle he grew exhausted. Ishbi-Benob saw his moment and moved in. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, one of David's most ruthless commanders, intercepted the giant before he could reach the king and struck him down. After that engagement, David's own men made him swear an oath. You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. The king who killed Goliath was now too valuable to risk on the battlefield. From this point forward, other men would finish the war he started. 3 giants remained. The second was Saph, also called Sippai, a warrior descended from the Rephaim. Sibbecai the Hushathite killed him. The text gives no speech, no dramatic confrontation, just a name, a lineage, and a death. 2 remained. The third was Lami, identified in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 5, as the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, Goliath's own brother. He carried a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam, the exact same description used for Goliath's weapon in 1 Samuel 17. The same family, the same weapon, the same fate. Elhanan, son of Jair, killed him. 1 remained. The fourth and final giant had no recorded name. He is described only by his extraordinary stature and a single unforgettable physical detail. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. 24 digits. He walked out in front of the army of Israel and taunted them. The same defiance his kinsman Goliath had displayed a generation earlier. The same arrogance. The same challenge. Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimei, stepped forward and killed him. And then there were none. 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 22, delivers the extinction statement. These 4 were descendants of the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. 3 generations of warfare. Moses struck down the last Rephaim king on the eastern bank of the Jordan. David killed their champion in the valley of Elah. And David's men hunted down the final 4 on the Philistine frontier, Goliath's kinsmen, the last living descendants of a bloodline that had terrorized the ancient world since before Abraham. The last recorded giant in the Bible died in Gath. He had no name. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. And when he fell in the dust, the Rephaim were finished. The giants are gone. But the story they leave behind is not about them. It is about the people who faced them. The entire giant narrative of the Bible pivots on 2 moments of decision separated by 45 years. Numbers chapter 13, Kadesh Barnea. 10 spies saw the Anakim and said, "We cannot attack those people. They are stronger than we are." Israel believed them. An entire generation, every man and woman over the age of 20, died in the wilderness without ever setting foot in the promised land. Joshua chapter 14, Hebron. Caleb, 85 years old, looked at the same Anakim, the same fortified cities, the same mountain that had terrified 10 men 45 years earlier. and said, "Give me this mountain." The giants did not change between Numbers 13 and Joshua 14. They were the same height. They carried the same weapons. They lived behind the same walls. God's promise did not change either. The only thing that changed was the faith of the man standing in front of them. Every giant in Scripture was defeated. Every single one. Moses struck down Og because God said, "Do not be afraid of him." Caleb took the mountain because God had promised it. David felled Goliath because he came in the name of the Lord of hosts. The weapon never determined the outcome. The God behind the man did. 3 generations. Moses began the war. Joshua carried it into Canaan. David finished it on the Philistine frontier. The pattern was identical every time. The man who trusted God won. The man who feared the giant lost everything. Now here is the question this story leaves with you. Every person watching this has a mountain they have not taken. Something standing between you and the place God has called you to be. Too big, too fortified, too impossible. A broken relationship. A calling you are afraid to pursue. A sin you are afraid to confront. A decision you have been avoiding for years. That is your Anakim. That is your Hebron. The question is not whether the giant is real. The giant is always real. The spies were not lying. The Anakim were genuinely enormous. The question was never about the size of the giant. It was about the size of the God standing behind the man willing to fight. Caleb did not ask for an easy assignment. He asked for the hardest one. At 85, he pointed at the mountain that had broken an entire nation and said, "Give me that one." Not because he was stronger than the giants, because he believed God's promise was stronger than his fear. The Nephilim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, and the Zamzummim, 5 races of giants stood between God's people and God's promise. 5 names, 5 territories, 5 fates. Every single one was cut down. The only generation that lost was the generation that refused to fight. Do not be that generation. Which of the 5 giant races surprised you the most? And what is the mountain you have been avoiding? Tell us in the comments below. Subscribe to Bible Origins. And to see what the world actually looked like before the waters fell, the lost civilizations, the advanced corruption, and what was truly happening across the earth before the flood, click the documentary appearing on your screen right now.